One of the things that L. Ron Hubbard came up with that was brilliant, really, and you have to give the guy credit because his church is still going 26 years after, almost 27 years after he died. Um, is that everything in Scientology is geared towards yourself. In other words, you don't go down to a church with 100 other people and hear a lecture about something that happened 2,000 years ago in a desert. Okay, you go down there as an individual. You sit down. You're given materials, and you're asked to come up with memories and discoveries about yourself. Scientology is completely inward directed. Now, can you see how attractive that is to a celebrity, to an actor?
I know. Hi, I'm Allison Hope Weiner, and welcome to another episode of Media Mayhem. I want to wish everybody a Happy New Year and welcome you all to the show. I hope everybody had a nice break. I know I did. And now, today, we are going to talk about something that has been fascinating me for a long time, but particularly over the last couple of months. There's been a lot written, and a lot of it has come from our guest today, Tony Ortega, who is with us. Thank you for joining us, Tony.
You bet. I'm glad I'm here, Allison.
So Tony's joining us via Skype from New York, and Tony has a blog where he writes about Scientology for those of us who are obsessed with it just about every day. But he has a long history of writing about Scientology. He's a former editor of The Village Voice. And when he was at The Village Voice, wrote a series of riveting pieces about Scientology and ex-Scientologists and sort of a lot about how the church works. He left to work on a book about Scientology, and he also is blogging every day at TonyOrtega.org. So you guys, I look at it. Other guests that have been on the show watch it quite a bit, like Mark Ebner, who both of us think very highly of Tony and his writing, and he really is one of the most straightforward people, you know, in terms of writing about Scientology and just about everything he writes about. So thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
The thing that I'm really excited about having you here is that I think one of the services that you're providing for people is there's been a absolute plethora or abundance of pieces about Scientology, former Scientologists coming forward, and you're kind of weeding through what's out there and telling people what you think are probably some of the best things written about Scientology. And one of those that you just recently wrote about on your blog that caught my eye, and part of it was Lawrence Wright's new book. And I wanted to ask you what you think. I mean, you did say in the piece, but just for our viewers, what you think of the book, and what do you think are some of the sort of breakout research or, I guess, great journalism that's coming out of that book about Scientology?
Well, we've been waiting for this one for a long time. As you said, I like to keep an eye on what's happening in general around the world of Scientology, because not only because Scientology fascinates me, but because we're clearly in the most crucial era of Scientology's history right now. The church is in the grips of several different crises. There's so many interesting news stories happening all the time. And one of them is this highly anticipated book that has grown out of an article that Lawrence wrote for the New Yorker back in 2011 about the director Paul Haggis. It was called The Apostate. It's 24,000 words. One of the best things ever written about Scientology. And, you know, for the last 2 years, I've been waiting for this book that Lawrence was growing out of that. I ran into Lawrence in the summer, and we talked about it. And it's just, he's a very thorough journalist. I'm the kind of guy, I want to write a little something every day. I just like to keep an eye on what's happening, whether it's Narcanon or Scientology or the celebrities or somebody's coming out of Scientology. He really takes his time and gets the full story, and he's such a good storyteller. So just yesterday, we saw 2 excerpts from that book come out at the Hollywood Reporter, one about John Travolta and his Scientology handler, Spanky Taylor, and the other one, a more lengthy piece about Tom Cruise and David Miscavige. And they're both just, you know, I called them predictably awesome. You know, we knew they were going to be great, but the level of detail, the man is such a patient journalist. He takes his time, he gets things right. And when was the last time you read the Hollywood Reporter and saw that the piece had footnotes in it?
I don't know. I thought you were going to say, when's the last time I read the Hollywood Reporter? That was the first time. I mean, I worked there, for full disclosure, for about a month. And I was kind of surprised that they'd even run it, given what I know about. And so I think that sort of says a lot in and of itself about where Scientology is right now.
Well, I think you're right. In general, the press is much more open to Scientology stories now. The fear is gone, and Scientology has a reputation of being one of the most litigious organizations on earth. But they haven't sued a newspaper or magazine specifically over Scientology since 1995 or something, and so that threat's kind of gone. But it's not just that the Hollywood Reporter, like everyone else, is fascinated. The Hollywood Reporter in general has done very good work on Scientology over the last year. I've noticed that they have taken more of an interest. They have several reporters who do very good work. And, not only did they excerpt these pieces from Larry's book, but the intros that they wrote were very well done, very well done. So I really hand it to the Hollywood Reporter that they're on top of this, and I like their enthusiasm.
Well, I do. I mean, I have to say, I like the enthusiasm, but I have to say, I don't know. They're on top of it after every other magazine in the country's already written about Scientology. I mean, it's seriously.
I think there's something personal going on here, Alice.
Well, you had Vanity Fair, you had The New Yorker, you had Newsweek, Daily Beast write about it, and now you've got Hollywood Reporter following up with from a great writer coming from another.
There's so many good publications, and
there
the
have
other.
been some. That's what all I'm saying is that I'm not. I think what's in there is great, and I think it's interesting. But I think that what it says to me as a journalist is that the subject is safe now, and that, like you said, that the lawsuits that are coming from somebody like from Burt Fields, who I've written extensively about, that
right.
Clearly the lawyers, and I've actually, I know a lot of the lawyers that have represented Scientology. It's big business out here. Because they do so much First Amendment and free speech work. They do a lot to further the interests of Scientology. So I think, to me, it says a lot about what's happened in the legal world and how Scientology has decided to handle their image, and it's so different than the way it used to be.
Well, and also another big part of that media story is how much the British press has changed its ways. The British press, particularly in the last 6 months, has just become obsessed with Scientology. And the way British newspapers can be, some of it's a little sloppy, some of it's a little sensational, but in general, they've been getting things right. And it's really been interesting to see them lose their fear of, because over there in the United Kingdom, the laws are different, and they risk a lot more by writing about Scientology than we do in the United States. So that's been also a big change. So Scientology is just getting it from all sides right now. And one book that just came out this week that's interesting is John Sweeney's book. He's the BBC guy who back in 2007 did an investigation of Scientology and lost his temper in a very famous way that became a viral YouTube phenomenon. And he came and revisited that period and wrote this book about it. And it came out this week, and it was really well done. But one of the things his book reminded me was how much more difficult it was in 2007 to write about Scientology. Back when Janet Reitman was writing about it for the Rolling Stone, it was tougher then than it is today. Today, Scientology just can't seem to handle all the different reporters that want requests. So back in 2007, but the point I was going to make was when John Sweeney was out there trying to get information, the strategy of the church then was to put their spokesman, Tommy Davis, on him and just harass him and just be brash and in his face to try to put the reporter off the story. 5 years later, they can't even attempt to do that. 5 years later, they can barely manage to put out statements. You'll notice you haven't seen a Scientology spokesperson being put out for a TV interview or anything like that. They just have no one today. And so they put out these statements. And I don't know if you saw the one they put out today about Lawrence Wright's book so far, or the one they put out a few days ago about a Los Angeles Magazine article. But these statements they're making are ludicrous. I mean, they're comical, and they make the church look even worse than they are. So the Scientology right now is in a PR death spiral, and I don't know how they're going to even get out of January. I mean, we've still got.
I know.
John Sweeney's
it's shocking
book
to me when I look at it, because I remember so clearly what it used to be like when you tried to write about Scientology, and you got phone calls, you got pressure. What has happened to Tommy Davis? What happened with him?
Tommy, like I said, Tommy was a very aggressive front for the church in 2007, And by 2009, he had virtually disappeared. Um, uh, there have been various theories about what it was that he did that made him lose favor with the leader of the church, David Miscavige. He said something on CNN that backfired on him. He said something to a Las Vegas or Inland Empire reporter in California that really was dumb. And then there was the way he handled Sweeney. I mean, you could look at any of those things. David Miscavige is a leader that kind of changes his mind pretty quickly. So one of those things torpedoed his career, and he virtually disappeared by 2010. Recently, we found out that he has left the Sea Organization and has moved to Texas. And a couple of reporters have attempted to reach him. In fact, I think Sweeney in his book mentions that he went out there to try to talk to him, but that so far Tommy Davis is not interested in giving an interview. I think that Larry Wright tried to reach out to him and Tommy Davis turned him away. But I'm waiting for the rest of the book to see if that's what did happen.
It's interesting because there was a lot of conversation out here in Los Angeles about where he is and what happened to him. And frankly, I heard the CNN, I've heard the CNN explanation, but I thought it was really interesting because it seems that with his absence, they really are in a major free fall. And even though there was terrible problems with how Scientology handled journalists, as a journalist, I say that, they did a much better job in years past.
Well, I think a bigger blow was not the loss of Tommy Davis, but Mike Rinder. Tommy was clearly a little bit in over his depth. He was a young guy. He was very brash. But it was, Mike Rinder, I think, was technically his boss. And Rinder was calm, cool, smart, and much better, I think, at handling reporters. So when Rinder defected in 2007, I think that was a really big blow for the Church of Scientology. In fact, if you want to trace all the crises that the church has gone through in the last few years, a lot of it traces back to the defection of top-level executives like Mike Rinder and Marty Rathbun. And once they decided to speak out in 2009, things really started to fall apart for the church.
Now, I know that I too have been critical of some of the statements made by the church because they do seem to be illogical and laughable at points. But what do you make of, just so for my viewers so they understand, of the continual, that one of their sort of standards is that whoever's writing about them hasn't talked to any Scientologists. Lawrence Wright, or Larry Wright, has said repeatedly that he talked to over 200 Scientologists. So
Sure.
What's true here, as far as you know?
Well, it depends on how you define the word Scientologist. Somebody like Mike Rinder, for example, who I just mentioned, was a top-level executive in the official church, the corporate church, for more than 20 years. He left the church, but he still adheres to the ideas of L. Ron Hubbard and considers himself a Scientologist, the way that a priest might decide to leave the priesthood of the Catholic Church and no longer work for the church, but still consider himself a Catholic. Why would you not consider him a Catholic, right?
Right.
So I talk to Mike Rinder frequently as a source. He is a Scientologist. But of course, the church would never agree to that. They would say that, no, you're not talking to me. But the other thing is that, keep in mind that Karen Powell doesn't really know what she's talking about. Larry Wright is not just talked to 200 Scientologists. He's talked to more than that. I've talked to more than that. I've talked to people who have completely left Scientology. I've talked to people who have left the official church but still consider them Scientologists. And yes, I have been talking to people who are actively still in the church and take a huge risk talking to me to feed me information. But that's how frustrated they are with David Miscavige and the direction of Scientology. I'm telling you, Allison, I'm getting to talk to people today, and I'm sure Larry is, and Mark Ebner and John Sweeney. We're getting to talk to people today we couldn't imagine talking to just 2 or 3 years ago. This church is in serious trouble. And it's really not because of the press. It's not because of the celebrities. It's not even because of these problems in their drug rehab that have been getting in the news. Scientology's trouble, Scientology's big crisis is internal. The people who are in Scientology are extremely unhappy with their leader. And if you want, I can give you a quick explanation for why that is.
Yes, go ahead. I was just going to ask you because it seems to me also that the timing, and I think you make a really good point, that it is, I mean, this is the leadership that has really alienated a lot of people. So tell me why that is. Go ahead with David Miscavige.
Whether you agree with them or not, however you think about their belief system, one of the things that's very consistent about Scientologists is that they care passionately about maintaining the ideas and processes that L. Ron Hubbard came up with 40, 50, 60 years ago. They do not want that to change. They want to do auditing. They want to recall their memories from earlier in their life and even in their past lives. They feel that they reach a spiritual enlightenment by doing that. And yes, they're willing to pay a lot of money for that. High-level Scientologists pay up to $1,000 an hour for that kind of spiritual counseling. Now, whether you or I think that's a bunch of hokum or not is beside the point. They believe it. They want to do it. And for the first 40, 50 years of the church, the big emphasis was on people moving up the bridge. What that meant is, as an individual Scientologist, your aim was your own case. You were trying to move up these levels. You were paying money for it. You were learning your own spiritual advancement. And it was expensive. And to some of the rest of us, it doesn't make sense. But at least the people who were in it felt that they were spending their time and money advancing their own case gain. What David Miscavige has done in the last 10 or 15 years has shifted that focus away from people moving up on their own progress, and instead is constantly asking them to pay money for donations for things like new buildings, a particular building in Florida called the Superpower Building,
right,
and for something called the International Association of Scientologists, the IAS, which is basically their defense fund. So Scientologists are constantly hit up for thousands and thousands of dollars of donations that go to these things that Miscavige is using, but that have nothing to do with their own individual cases. And so you talk to Scientologists who say, I haven't been able to move up a level in years, because every dime I make, I'm giving to the church so they can build a new building that they don't need. Now, again, from the outside, this all may seem kind of arcane and strange, but to Scientologists, it's very real. David Miscavige, they really believe David Miscavige has the focus on the wrong thing.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Before David Miscavige, were there the prison, the prison details? Was there punishment? Or, I mean, the things that have come to light in the last year or so, and actually, I mean, pretty recently, certainly in Maureen Orth's article, I mean, that you're hearing from ex-Scientologists and Marty's book, I wonder, is that something that has been overused by Miscavige, or does that not play into the dissatisfaction and the sort of rejection of Scientology by so many people?
Well, what I was trying to explain to you is why individual Scientologists are frustrated right now with their church.
Okay.
Now, along with that, as you say, there are these alleged abuses. And so, for example, there's the disconnection policy, which is that, let's say your entire family is all in the Church of Scientology, but that you decide you've had enough of it and you decide to leave, and you leave in a way that they don't like. Like, you might say something publicly about how you don't like the church anymore. What they will do is excommunicate you, and their version of that is called declare you a suppressive person, or SP. Once you have been declared an SP, every other Scientologist in the world can have nothing else to do with you, even if that means the own members of your family. So you have mothers completely cutting off sons or daughters. You have, sons or daughters completely cutting off brothers, sisters. I mean, but one of the things is that's been going on through the entire history of the church. That was going on under Hubbard, and it's going on now. So yes, some of the people coming out today who are frustrated by the change in donations and that kind of thing, they are saying things like disconnection are much worse than they ever were. I think to a certain extent they're looking at the past through rose-colored glasses. I think these kind of control mechanisms were always there. And Hubbard put them in. Hubbard put in disconnection. Hubbard put in the layers of interrogation and control. If you suspect that somebody else is having bad thoughts about Scientology, you have to turn them in with something called a knowledge report. I just talked to a man who's 75 years old, whose own 32-year-old daughter turned him in because he asked her to watch a Nightline episode about Scientology. So, because this man had bad, impure thoughts about Scientology, his own daughter turned him in. They kicked him out of the church. They kicked him out of his house. He's now homeless. I mean, that's the culture of interrogation and control in the Church of Scientology, and that's not new.
Okay, that's what I was wondering about. But let me ask you this. Something else that has fascinated me is that most of the articles that are being written, they focus on celebrities because I guess, that gets eyeballs or that gets, people watching it on television or whatnot. But my question is, do you think that celebrities like Travolta or like Tom Cruise are aware of what goes on at the lower levels of Scientology? I mean, because what the general discussion is around when I've talked to people is that there's sort of at least two different kinds of existence is in the church, and there's the way the top people function and the way the people at the bottom function. And
Right.
I'm curious because Cruise and these gentlemen are known as being, particularly Tom Cruise, as being very nice and very affable and very charitable. So does he know, do you think, just to focus on him, about what's going on at the lower levels of the church?
Well, actually, one of the eye-opening things in the excerpts that Larry Wright published yesterday was about John Travolta. If I can focus on him first, Travolta had a woman who was his Scientology handler named Spanky Taylor, and in Larry's excerpt, he writes about how Spanky went through some really intense punishment and rehabilitation, and John Travolta must have known at least some of that. I mean, they were very close friends. And so I thought it was a very significant new story to add to the canon, because it shows that somebody like Travolta has to know that some of these lower level Scientologists, what they're going through. Tom Cruise, it's really hard for me to believe that Tom Cruise is not aware of the kind of life that Sea Org members live. And that's not only because he has made multiple trips out to the international base near Hemet, and has seen how these people live and how they work, but he's had them at his own house. I mean, I did a story last summer about a man named John Brousseau, whose name you're starting to see more and more. I think Larry's got a lot about him in his book. Maureen Orth wrote about him quite a bit in her Vanity Fair article. But I wrote the first really lengthy series of stories about John Brousseau's life. He's a fascinating guy. One of his jobs was to remodel Tom Cruise's homes. And he took teams out there and they worked around the clock, improving everything in the guy's house, including what kind of light bulbs to use. And so Tom Cruise had to have seen the way they worked, how hard they worked, and that they were paid almost nothing. I mean, one of the things John Brousseau is known for is he also improved Tom's vehicles.
Right.
You saw that, where he took an SUV.
Yeah. I read your piece, yeah.
Where he took an SUV and he remodeled the interior from the wood of a eucalyptus tree that had fallen at the base or something.
Yeah,
so it was supposed to be a special totem of the international base, even to the point of making a pen out of the eucalyptus wood.
This is such a Los Angeles story. Fix my cars up. I know.
Exactly. And Brousseau was being paid like $25, $30 a week to do that kind of work. And it's just, was Tom Cruise aware of it? Tom Cruise has said that he very much admires the people in the Sea Org and would have joined it if he could have. And I broke the story that his own daughter, Isabella, was facing the possibility of joining the Sea Org because Isabella's boyfriend joined. And once once one of them joins the Sea Org, the other one either joins also or they have to break up. And my sources were telling me that Isabella was seriously considering the possibility of joining the Sea Org. So you just have to know that Tom Cruise is fully aware of the hardships of the Sea Org because he has said he admires them for it. So these celebrities are probably not as sheltered as people sometimes think they are.
And let me ask you this, that is something else that kind of fascinates me. In the coverage, and I'll have to, there's one exception to this, but a lot of the coverage has talked about about the relationship between Tom Cruise and David Miscavige, but nobody's written about the rumors about the homosexuality. I mean, you don't really see, it's like, because I guess because of the defamation laws or whatever, that you don't see it, but it certainly is something that's discussed behind closed doors by all journalists and in front of a camera by Mark Ebner. But,
I'll tell you, you know, what I believe to be the truth. And I've talked to people that know Tom Cruise extremely well. And every source that I make that really knows Tom well, and it's not just somebody guessing about him, every single one of them tells me that he's not gay. That he, you know, just unequivocally. And I know some of the stories and some of the things that Gawker likes to spread around, but I've just never seen anything to change my mind about that. I mean, the guy loves women, and I don't, you know, I think anytime you have a good-looking actor with that much success, there are always going to be gay rumors, but they just aren't true with Tom Cruise. I can't say the same for John Travolta, but that's another story.
Yeah, I mean, and we should say in this discussion, I mean, I feel like very Seinfeld-esque, not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just that that's a big part of why people talk about David Miscavige and Tom Cruise's relationship being very close. And so then I would guess that your take on that is that it's just a really close friendship?
I think it's you know, people like to say it's an unusually close relationship, and they, you know, hint, hint, wink,
right,
wink.
I know, but
I think it is an unusually close relationship, but for more interesting ways. And that I get from John Brousseau. Again, John Brousseau is such a fascinating guy because he worked out at the base. He actually was David Miscavige's brother-in-law for about 16 years. And like I said, he worked in Tom Cruise's home. He spent Christmas with Tom and Katie at their Telluride home. This guy knows these people really, really well. It's John Brousseau who explained to me what nobody else ever has. And that he says that they are very, very close, but it's a very uneven relationship. Now, you might expect that the church leader is in awe of the movie star, but Brousseau swears it's the other way around. And that's what makes it so fascinating. His words were, Tom Cruise worships David Miscavige like a god. And Miscavige doesn't feel that way at all. In fact, Miscavige, you know, makes fun of the guy behind his back. You know, when Tom Cruise audits, just like everybody else audits, he's audited on camera. Okay, so he sits there in a counseling session holding the sensors of this little lie detector machine, and they ask him, you know, when he does his 6-month sec check, and they interrogate him the way they interrogate all Scientologists, which means they want him to give up his sexual secrets, and he does so. We have reports that Miscavige will have friends over, they'll watch the tapes of Tom Cruise talking about his sex life, and they'll joke about it. Now, does that sound like a respectful best friend? Not at all.
Right.
I mean, the reports by Brousseau and Tom DeVotte and some of these other people really paint a picture that Tom Cruise is in thrall to David Miscavige, but Miscavige kind of thinks of him as somebody he can kind of like play around with and, you know, abuse his trust. So in that way, it's a very strange, uneven relationship. And the more these stories come out, I'm just astonished that they don't at some point get through to Tom Cruise and say, why are you placing so much trust in this guy who behind your back makes fun of you, thinks that, you know, you're kind of a tool that he's using to get what he wants? But for all the people I've talked to that really knew these two men well, that's the picture I get.
Well, that's really interesting. I had never heard that before, but it has a ring of veracity to me because, yeah, I mean, and I think as a celebrity that, I mean, I wouldn't see that Tom Cruise would be reading anything that's written about the church, except for to hear it third or fourth.
I hear he's not much of a reader at all, Allison.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, he has his issues with that. Yeah, I've heard the same thing. And I believe that it is true. His dyslexia gives him a lot of trouble in that area. But I wanted to ask you too about what you thought about Maureen Orth's take on Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes' divorce, and other takes that have been written about it that basically Katie became dissatisfied. This is the story, and certainly what we heard from Mark Ebner, that she became dissatisfied and concerned about the influence of the church on Surrey, and that was the reason that she left. And I'm wondering if that's what you heard from your sources, and if you think, if you were shocked at how quiet how quietly the divorce was done, especially for a Hollywood divorce.
Oh, I think she caught everyone by surprise. Maureen did such a great job in that story. One of the things she had in there that I thought was wonderful, she was able to get information that Martin, Katie's father, had expressed concerns about Scientology before Katie even married Tom. So I think that Katie and her father plotted this escape for a long time. I mean, Katie's been tight-lipped. She won't address any of the questions about why she did it. But when you look at how she did it, that the way she just surgically removed herself from that situation by filing in New York City, by moving into that place she had all set up, by switching out all her phones, by hiring an entirely different security detail, all while he's in Iceland filming a movie. I mean, there's just no question she was well aware I'm sorry, that she was well aware of the history of how Scientology can interfere with these kind of matters, and she wanted to make sure she had the upper hand. So all of those things tell me that she was very aware of what she was dealing with. Now, what was the concern about Surrey? There were a lot of different stories that came out at that time. People were immediately pointing to the Sea Org and saying, could Surrey be sucked into that Sea Org, which I'd mentioned earlier. I personally, I doubted it at the time, but then when I saw what happened with Isabella, I thought maybe it was more of a possibility that Surrey could face the Sea Org. But there's no question that at 6 years old, Surrey was getting into the time when a child of Scientologists will start their training and start their auditing, at least on a low level. And the day after the divorce was announced, I actually dug up a document I hadn't seen before. It was fascinating. L. Ron Hubbard in 1961 had actually created an interrogation sheet for children as young as 6. And this thing is so creepy. The first question they ask a 6-year-old child is, "What have you been told not to say?" So obviously, who's the target of that interrogation? The parents.
Right.
I mean, so they're teaching like I said earlier, Scientology has a culture of interrogation and control, and they're teaching young kids to be snitches right away.
I know, it's sort of like the Squealer Church.
And keep in mind, Katie was around Tom's older kids, and she would have seen them going through their 6-month sec checks and their auditing. She would have gotten an education. Even, I know people have questioned how much Katie herself, how much training she got. But whether she got much training or not, she saw Tom's kids going through Scientology, and she may have seen things she didn't want for Surrey.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, I've been very curious about it, and I've heard different explanations, and I know, and I think that it's interesting that you mentioned that document, because people weren't clear about what the procedure was for a child at 6 years old. And so obviously there is some history for questioning and auditing.
And I've talked to people like Claire Headley, who said she went through that interrogation at only 7 or 8 years old.
That's so frightening as a parent, because you know how much a 6-year-old can tell about stuff. I know. Let me talk to you about the rap video that ended up on Gawker that you procured. Right. I want to give a chance. Let's take a look at it first, and then we'll talk about it. It's going to go up. Sorry?
I'm going to set it up first, and then you show it?
Why don't you set it up first? Yeah, go ahead.
So Maureen had done that story. I was actually aware of parts of it, but she did a brilliant job bringing it all out. And all of her sources are the same people I talked to, and I knew that they were all telling the truth about this Nazanin Boniati, who had been selected as one of Tom Cruise's girlfriend, and that they had lived together for something like 3 months, and then he dumped her through Tommy Davis, and it was a great story. But the only thing that was kind of missing was there were no photographs of them, and Nazanin herself wasn't talking. And as much as I knew that what Maureen was saying was the complete truth, I felt like it sure would be nice to get some, additional corroborating evidence that Nazanin felt this way. Well, as I was talking to my sources, a couple of them started telling me, well, Tony, there is this thing out there. I don't know if you can get it, but several ex-Scientologists used to hang around with this guy named Tiziano Lulli, who's an ex-Scientologist from Italy, who was a pop star in Italy, and today lives in Los Angeles in this wonderful home where he's got a home studio, and he's a music producer. And when he would have his fellow ex-Scientologists over, and they would, talk about how awful it was to work at the international base, one of them just started rhyming about it. And they got the idea, let's do a rap song about how awful David Miscavige is and what it's like to work for Scientology. And so when these ex-Scientologists would come to Los Angeles to visit Tiziano, he would say, I want you to write a few lines and then sit down in my studio and we're going to record you. So he recorded Mike Rinder rapping.
Right.
He recorded Marty Rathbun rapping. And one of the people who contributed was Nazanin Boniadi. So when I heard this, I said, I've got to see that. Sorry. And so when I was out in LA in October, November, I visited Tiziano, and I was actually with the British film crew. I was helping them make a documentary about Scientology, and he played it for us, and we had cameras rolling. And I was like, wow, can you do it? Can you play it again? Because I wanted to make sure I had it.
It's a great scoop. I mean, because it's things you never see. And people you never get to see.
What you're watching is Tiziano Lulli in his home studio playing back this rap song for us. And you see one of the British guys with his camera in the background. And I just got my little flip cam, and I'm just doing my best to hold it still as he plays this back and he sort of dances to it and sings to it. So then I immediately went back to where I was staying and got on my laptop and started putting in the subtitles. And I messed up a few of them, but they're basically right. And so I show you when Nazanin Boniadi comes in and raps a few lines. And it's only a few lines, but it's significant because she actually names Tom Cruise, John Travolta, and Kirstie Alley.
Okay, so let's play it, guys.
Single girl dealing with life when you painted a picture perfect paradise. So I did get rich, not once but twice. A couple of $100 G's so you can live a life of luxury, surrounded by celebrities. But we all know how it is. This ain't no road to freedom. It's a blind alley like Kirstie Alley, Travolta, Cruise. But we ain't no fools.
When you think you're old mind and begin to speak back, they put you under X-Pig surveillance attack. Private eyes and unmarked cars, black PR, reputation bars. But at the end of the day, it don't mean jack when you're chilling and sipping iced tea at the shack. You see, the little dictator ain't nothing but a hack. Well, like Kobe say, you can't harm me, Jack. You can't harm me, Jack.
It's pretty wild.
It is wild, and by the way, that Storm Lee who comes in on the choruses, that is the Storm Lee who has appeared on things like what is it, X Factor or American, I don't know what it is, but he's a well-known singer. He's very good. It's a fun song, It's these former Scientologists blowing off steam about what it was like to work there. But it's significant because this is the first time we've heard Nazanin herself expressing her disillusion with Scientology. And so for that reason, I gave it to Gawker, they put it up, and it just went crazy. And that was a few days before the Newtown massacre, which then, of course, took over the news. But it was, it was a fun thing to do.
Something that's interesting to me, listening to you as a journalist, that when you talk about other people writing about it, you don't seem to have like a competitive edge about who they've talked to, and that you're able to acknowledge other people's great work. And since this is a show about the media, I'm just curious if it's difficult because a lot of these people talk to multiple journalists, that you're not getting the exclusive. I mean, you seem to deal with it in a really, really classy and unjournalistic way. I mean, I'm talking to my audience, and I keep hearing you be so complimentary to other journalists, and it's interesting because I know you've written extensively, and you beat a lot of these guys on some of this information.
Well, thank you. Look, I work very hard to get scoops, and I've actually had a lot of them. They don't always get noticed, but I had a lot of scoops this last year because I talked to a lot of people, and I work hard to get scoops. But, I'll just say it right out. I had a shot at the Nazanin Boniadi story almost a year before Maureen did, and I just couldn't put it together. There were just various legal reasons and other things, I just was not able to do that story. And then she came along and did a beautiful job with it. Now I can mope and be unhappy about it and curse her, but the fact is, she did a great job on a beautiful story, and I'm just glad it's out there. I mean, look, I know how hard my fellow journalists work. Larry Wright, I mean, God, the research he puts in, John Sweeney, and especially the guys from the Tampa Bay Times, Joe Childs and Tom Tobin. We're all trying to compete with each other and beat each other to scoops. But I guess ultimately, I'm just so interested in this story being told by more people, because it's a story that I think gets to the heart of how America's really most cherished values can be manipulated by a totalitarian organization, as John Sweeney likes to call it. I think that it's better for journalists to kind of support each other. But I try to be charitable because I know how hard they work,
I know. I mean, I think it's really, it is. I was thinking that because sometimes I read these and some of the stories are kind of a rehash of everything that's already out there. And when I first started to read about Paul Haggis, Larry writing about Paul Haggis, I was like, well, this is really nothing new, because we all knew about that already. And Paul Haggis, even if it hadn't been, I shouldn't say we all knew, but it was already starting to percolate, and he'd spoken on background to people already about the church. So, I mean, not exclusively like that on the record, but I am curious what you think about Spanky Taylor showing up, in Lawrence Wright's book, and her experience with Scientology. And because the one thing that struck me is I've heard from other journalists that she spoke before on background, and suddenly she's come out and spoken on the record. And most of the people that write about Scientology told me that they were really surprised. So I'm curious what you thought about her becoming an integral part of his book and speaking on the record, and what you think might have prompted that change of heart.
I called her right away. I wanted to know. Yeah, I mean, this is shocking. I mean,
you're like, hey, I've been calling. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I don't want to. Look, Spanky Taylor is one of these legendary folks who is, if you read Larry's thing, you can see how interesting she is. She worked with John Travolta at a crucial time. She went through hell. That woman went through hell with her child. And I don't know if that full story has been told. We'll see how much of it Larry puts in his book. But I thought she would never say anything publicly, because
that's what I heard. Yeah,
there are a lot of people who keep one thing in mind. When I think you brought, I don't know if we brought this up yet, but Karen Powell, the church spokeswoman, was talking about that 200 number.
Yes,
the people over at Anonymous have documented more than 2,000 church members who have now come forward and spoken publicly. But those are the people who are willing to speak publicly. For every person like a Mark Headley or a John Brousseau or Tom DeVaught or Amy Scobie or Jenna Miscavige Hill, for every one of those people who come forward and says, this is who I am, I was in the church and this is what I went through, there are so many more Spanky Taylors and other people who went through just as much abuse and just manipulation, who will never tell their stories. And I hear from those people almost every day. Almost every day. I have somebody call me up and say, Tony, you can't tell my story, but I'm an OT7. I left in 2005. I can't say anything because my daughter's still in the church, and if I say anything, she'll cut off all ties to me. So when you hear that there are 2,000 people who have left and are unhappy with Scientology, there's got to be at least 10 for every one of those people that are out there who can't talk. And, I was one who thought Spanky Taylor would forever never say anything, because she's still involved in a business that could be seriously harmed by speaking publicly. And that's why, I called her right away yesterday and said, wow, this is amazing. And I want to check in with her and see how she's doing, because there could be serious fallout.
I would have called her to say, why didn't you talk to me first? So I'm like, that's all I was thinking while you were saying, yes, I called her. I'd be like, ksh, ksh.
I mean, I told her I didn't blame her. I mean, Larry Wright's book, if you are going to come out, that's the place to do it. I mean, Larry's book is going to be great. And what they're doing, like a first print run of 150,000 copies. This is a major work in this field.
I wanted to ask you as a last question, because we're getting close to the end of time of our time here together. I wanted to ask you, we were chatting about it a little bit before the show, but why do you think actors are particularly susceptible to practicing Scientology?
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. I think that, we hear about how pampered they are and they're treated differently at the Celebrity Center. But I think also you have to look at the philosophies of Scientology and the actual work that they do in the church. One of the things that L. Ron Hubbard came up with that was brilliant, really, and you have to give the guy credit because his church is still going 26 years after, almost 27 years after he died, is that everything in Scientology is geared towards yourself. In other words, you don't go down to a church with 100 other people and hear a lecture about something that happened 2,000 years ago in a desert. Okay, you go down there as an individual. You sit down. You're given materials, and you're asked to come up with memories and discoveries about yourself. Scientology is completely inward directed. Now, can you see how attractive that is to a celebrity, to an actor?
I know. I think that's so funny, but it's so true. I mean, it really, it is such a drag to be talking about parting the Red Sea when you could be involved. Right?
Exactly.
Right. No, I think it's interesting, and I was saying the same thing about Kabbalah out here, and I know that there's the practice of Kabbalah that is like its own special church, not the part that's a part of Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, but the Kabbalah practice is also very self-centered and very focused on you talking about you. And although it's a bit of a stereotype with the actors, there's stereotypes always have come from quite a bit of truth. And they do enjoy talking about themselves. And I also think that they like that whole self-discovery. Plus, it's not terribly, challenging to talk about yourself. It's not that hard for people that like to do it. So, thank you so much for being here today. I have to switch back before I say too many bad things about actors. But you know what? I've learned a lot, and there's a lot of. There's been a lot written, and I do think that there's a lot of crap that's out there that it isn't true, and where people just sort of surmise things. And I know that you spend a lot of your time and a lot of your energy talking to real sources and really vetting this and really doing a real journalist job and doing the job of finding out what the truth is, and you're not just doing it to guess at things. So
thank you very much, and I think that's one of the reasons why Larry's book is going to be good, because what I think Larry and I are both interested in is we really want to know why this is so seductive. With Scientology is not as big as it says it is, but it still attracts a certain number of people and has for 60 years, and there has to be something to it. And so I'm really interested in learning that truth rather than just, making fun of it.
Well, I thank you for that, and I tell our audience to take a look at your blog, TonyOrtega.org, because Tony writes just about every day about something that's happening, and he also can give you a sense of what you should be reading and what's good and what's right, or what he thinks is well sourced, so that you'll get the right information. I also would point everybody to Janet Reitman's book as well on Scientology, and also to her appearance on the show, if you want to take a look back and see what she had to say about that entire experience of writing the book, and which was written before this kind of explosion of stories in different magazines about it. And I look forward to reading it and having you back on to give us your take after you've had a chance to read the whole book.
Would love to.
Okay, well, take care. And thanks so much for joining us. And to our audience, be sure to keep subscribing and to stick with us and to comment on shows, because I'm reading it and I'd like to talk to you. Thanks so much. Have a good day.